nehme mal an, das hat mit dem...
You went into the kitchen cupboard, got yourself another hour, and you gave half of it to me. We sat there looking at the faces of the strangers in the pages till we knew mathematically they were in our minds until forever. But we didn't mind, we didn't know better. So we made our own computer out of macaroni pieces, and it did our thinking while we lived our lives. It counted up our feelings and divided them up even, and it called our calculation perfect love. Didn't even know that love was bigger. Didn't even know that love was so, hey, 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 this fire, it's burning, burning us up. Hey, this fire, it's burning, burning us up. Ooh, ooh. So we made the hard decision, and we each made an incision past our muscles and our bones. Our hearts were little stones. Pulled them out, they weren't beating, and we weren't even bleeding. As we laid them on a granite countertop, we beat them up against each other. We beat them up against each other. We struck them hard against each other. We struck them so hard until they sparked. Hey, this fire, it's burning, burning us up. Hey, this fire, it's burning, burning us up. Hey, this fire, it's burning, burning us up. Ooh, ooh, ooh,
So that song's called The Calculation, and it's very apposite for today. So she built a computer out of macaroni pieces. I don't know how well that works. But the idea was, as she said, it did our thinking while we lived our lives. And what did the machine do? It calculated our feelings. Right? So that's what we're going to talk about today. Ethics as a technological problem. Okay, we start. So engineers like me love tools, right? And so therefore, of course, I like this quote, which puts tools front and center. All of human history, upon close scrutiny, ultimately resolves into the history of the invention of better tools. Okay, you can argue with it, but I think it's a good statement. Algorithms can be reprogrammed. It's much harder, but not impossible, to recode social systems and institutions than computers. So these two quotes provide an entry point to the point of this lecture, which is really based around a paper I wrote a few years ago, and it's in the readings for you, called The AI of Ethics. Not the ethics of AI, the AI of ethics. So I didn't make a mistake, it was a deliberate title. So it appeared in this book that came out a little while ago, but as I said, the paper's available for you. So what's my stance in that paper and in this lecture? So what I try to do is I'll say first I will make a caricature of the way the ethics of AI, our broad topic in this course, the way that's normally thought of. Now, it's a caricature, right? I know I'm being slightly unfair, but whatever. I'm the one talking, so I get to do that. Often people will say machines have bias and therefore they should not make decisions about people. AI is fundamentally different to other technologies. Ethics is just principles, and if we figure out the principles well enough, we can fix AI. Ethical reasoning is all done inside a human's head. Ethical decisional autonomy is binary and unambiguous. It's clear when and where and who makes a decision. Decisions are conceptually, spatially, and temporally atomic. It's another way of saying the same thing, right? The atomicity of a decision. More information always helps when you make decisions, and ethical decision-making should be reserved to unaided humans, not machines. So you can find plenty of papers that essentially argue that. They might not say it in those words, but they're pretty common tropes, right? So what I tried to do in this paper, so this is the mathematician Jacobi. You must have met the Jacobian. So he had this lovely precept, right, which is useful for solving all sorts of problems, mathematical and otherwise, which is always invert. Right? That's it. That's the lesson. Always invert. So sometimes trying to follow, you're trying to solve the problem in the forward direction. You're not getting anywhere. Try and solve it backwards. Right? So I thought everyone's worrying about the ethics of AI. What about the AI of ethics? Let's explore that and see where it takes us. I'm not saying you should not ask the question about the ethics of AI. It's more we're kind of stuck, right? So can we think about it in a different way? So the outline of the lecture, what we'll cover today, I'll finally get to explain the title of the course, Beyond Fairness. I'll talk about principles versus concrete action, the sense in which technological artifacts have a moral status, the idea of building tools for thought rather than, say, tools for digging a hole, how you can think about ethics as a natural phenomenon that can be studied scientifically, exactly what is a decision, and related to that, how delegation plays a very significant role in trying to understand the ethical dimensions of using computers. So that's what we're covering today. So why Beyond Fairness? Oh, and so Australia is normally nice and warm. There was one day in 2017 where it was freezing cold where I was. So these pictures are from up in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales. It was like -7 or something or other. So this is frost on some barbed wire, which I thought was cool. It's got nothing to do with the lecture except that it's freezing cold. So why Beyond Fairness? So this lady is Anna Verzbicka. She's a very famous linguist who was at the ANU where I used to be. She developed lots of things, including the theory of semantic primes, the elemental semantic units of human language. There's a nice Wikipedia page on that. But I'm just talking about a much more specific observation that she made in one of her books. And it is, as stated here, fairness is not actually a universal notion. Universal across cultures and languages, I mean. So this is what she actually wrote. For native speakers of English, including many scholars, it is simply unimaginable that fairness should not be a universal human concern. She goes on to say, in fact, fair is a relatively recent linguistic innovation and one which is absent in many languages. Now, I was astonished when I first read this because I certainly thought that this is, a really basic thing. Surely everyone wants fairness, right? I mean, there must be a word for it in all languages. She is a world-renowned linguist and she's looked into the matter. She wrote a whole chapter in one of her books about that. Or maybe it was a paper, but anyway, it's in the readings. So this is a little bit of a prompt, right? To maybe not take it seriously is not the right word, but not take it as a centerpiece of what we want to do, right? So, the ethical use of AI technology in general, you can't equate it to just being fair. I've already made that point a couple of lectures ago, but I just wanted to have this little side note on the linguistics of it. So that's all I'm going to say about that, right? She's the expert. I think that paper's kind of interesting. So another thing I want to get out of the way pretty quickly, so I sort of want to mention it in order to explain why I'm not going to go and look at it, is a distinction between principles and, say, concrete action. So over the past several years, there's been a lot of literature where people try and come up with, let's come up with the different AI principles, right? Different countries produce these documents. They're very, I don't know, sanctimonious, and they read like treacle. They're just, I don't think it helps at all. I found this astonishing infographic that tried to make sense of a huge stack of these. So they hoovered up all of these different AI ethics principles from around the world and tried to make a map of them. And you can see there's a lot of nice abstract nouns there: privacy, accountability, safety, security, transparency, explainability, fairness, non-discrimination, responsibility, human values. And, you know, around the edge here are all of the various documents that they looked at: AI for Europe, AI in the UK, AI in Mexico, and you try to make a map. Now, I don't know, you can admire their industry and their graphical design skills, but I don't know what else you can actually get out of that. And, you know, I don't think it's that unfair to say, by analogy, it's like saying of any other technology, right? We want to make good technology. So what should we do? Oh, we want to make it reliable, repairable, efficient, environmentally responsible, interoperable, all of these abstract nouns on the left-hand side, right? Sure, of course you do. And you want to ring your mum every week and, you know, take out your trash, right? But it doesn't actually solve the problem, right? So notwithstanding the amount of ink and paper that's spent on this, we're not going to look at this any further because I just don't think it helps. But I am going to give you a reason, a logic for not doing that. So it's one thing to say, bah, I don't want to go and look at it. It's better to say, I'm not going to go and look at that, and I've got a sound reason not to. And the sound reason not to is that I think they're simply operating at the wrong level of abstraction. So this is a general point. It doesn't apply just to our course. It's a universal thing. I talk to my research students a lot about this. You're faced with some problem, right? You can just try and solve the problem as it's given to you, or you can try and think of a more concrete instance of it, or you can think of a more abstract version of it. So this is kind of hierarchy of abstraction. And people have put some effort into trying to clarify what that means, right? So we can talk about that in the tutorial if you want, and I can give you some pointers to how you even think of the idea of different levels of abstraction, right? Anyway, so that's the thing. This fellow, Stephen Toulmin, wrote this very nice short paper. It's also in the recommended reading, called The Tyranny of Principles. And he was looking at this very specific question to do with ethical decision making, right? And he gives a very specific context. So he was involved in an ethical review board. So there was, to my recollection, it was a hospital which treated patients that were not in a position to give informed consent. Maybe they were in a coma, or maybe they are young children or something, right? These people were in a bad way, and a very consequential decision had to be made about some medical procedure. Should we do this or should we not? Ideally, you would ask the person can't answer. So what does a hospital do? Quite reasonably, they assemble a board of people, very diverse. They've got a philosopher, they've got a theologian, they've got a lawyer, right? They've got a housewife or whatever. Cross-section of society, and the idea is that they put the case to this board and the board gives a recommendation. This is the way the doctors can protect themselves, right? But it's also, there's a positive side of it. Anyway, that was the context. As he explained in the paper, he had this very surprising experience there. On each case, right, it turned out all of the cases, they're all complicated, they're all very different, but in general, the board always agreed on what should be done. In this case, I'm sorry to say, we should take the person off life support. In this case, yes, we should do the risky operation. They agreed on the decision. But then, when they were asked, what was your reasoning for that? right? What was the principles that you applied, right? How did you arrive at your decision? They disagreed, and they disagreed violently, right? So I thought this was very interesting, right? Here is a real hard, consequential ethical problem. And if you looked at the discussions that they had at the level of the ethical principles to apply, you got no agreement whatsoever. But if you looked at it at the level of action, right, what you should actually do, everyone agreed, right? Now, I don't know whether that happens always, but the fact that it happened at all, I think, is kind of surprising. Yep.
I would have thought that was the point. I mean, why would you make a board with people from different backgrounds if not to have different reasons?
That may well be, but you could have imagined a priori that in many of the cases they would disagree on the decisions, right? Right? So the surprising point was as he reports, they agreed on the decisions, but they generally disagreed on the logic behind it.
Were they asked separately and then their answers compared?
I can't recall. I can't recall. Maybe he says that in the paper. I read this paper a couple of years ago.
Because there can be a dynamic.
It could have been groupthink. Yes.
Then everybody agrees.
I don't know. Look, I wanted to give at least some justification for not just keeping our discussion at the level of principles. This is one of them, right? I think it's kind of interesting, right? So with that, I sweep arguments about principles out of the way, but I encourage you to go and read that. Another thing to think about, so remember our topic is treating ethics as a technological problem. We can turn that around and say, well, suppose we've got some technical artifact, a piece of technology, if you like. In what sense does it have any ethical attributes at all? Its moral status. And so there's another nice paper I'm encouraging you to read by this fellow, Peter Paul Verbeek, some misunderstandings about the moral significance of technology. He gives a bunch of nice examples of how to go and think about this. And one of the points he's arguing about, which is quite common when you talk to a lot of philosophers, and also I think a lot of lay people, they're most anxious at the very thought of having a machine make moral decisions, right? Surely, this is something that, unaided people should do. This notion of delegating it to a machine, you're already evil. Before you even tell me how the machine works, you've already made the wrong decision, right? So that's what he's talking about. And well, I want you to read this. I think it's nicely reasoned. He asks this particular question: do artifacts have morality? And answers, like I did in the earlier lecture, that you need to view this as mediation. So this is a point I'll reinforce several times, like just this distinction between, oh, here's a piece of technology and it's doing something. So, we need to go and think about that. We need to work out how to regulate it. We need to work out how to design it. The technologies never do something on their own, right? They're delegates for other people who have commissioned, built, designed them, deployed them, right, to do stuff. So he makes that point rather well. This is how he concludes. You can read the whole thing. I'll just read the highlighted bit. Only by acknowledging the fundamentally mediating role of technologies in moral actions and decisions can we better understand the character of human morality. So this is a stronger point. He's not merely saying that it's a good idea insofar as you want to understand the effect of technology in these complicated situations. Even understanding the way humans behave ethically, it's worthwhile always keeping in mind this idea of mediation. Anyway, I gave you some other pointers there, but the one in pink is something I'd want you to read. And they've given you a few other interesting readings here that I don't know. I don't think there's a common thread there other than trying to go beyond a simple-minded notion that the technological artifacts are, let's say, morally neutral, or they're just disembodied from the people who designed them. But if this stuff interests you, I give you those pointers. Okay, so that's, I think, the last thing I want to kind of deal with rather quickly. This next topic I want to go into slightly more detail, and that is to develop this notion of tools for thought, right? As opposed to, tools for digging a hole or building a bridge or something like that. So, first question we should ask, right, is whether there's something already wrong in this idea of having tools for thought. Forget about the ethical side of it. It's just, how anxious are you in having a machine do your thinking for you? And surprisingly, people have thought about this for some time. So both these quotes are over 100 years old, right? Alfred North Whitehead, civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking about them. So the context in which he said this, right? So I think what goes before that, he said something like, people often say, we should think about things. All of the problems that we encounter are because we didn't think about things well enough. And he says, on the contrary, right, things go well when we can work out how to not think about stuff. Likewise, William James, the more of the details of our daily life we can hand over to the effortless custody of automatism, the more our higher power of mind will be set free for their own proper work. You delegate to the machine things that are worth delegating to. I'll give you an example shortly. So this, yeah?
Yeah, about the last quote, I think it's also about habits, right? Because it also is like an automatism. If you have an habit and you don't have to think about it really.
That's right. Yes, indeed. And the example I'll give you shortly will elucidate that point. Indeed. And this is a very nice point because deciding yourself to behave in an automatic, rule-driven way just for convenience so you don't have to think about it already helps you. You think, when I wake up in the morning, the idea of having to decide what I'm going to have for breakfast, I don't want to do that. I've pre-decided it's always going to be this, right? That's my strategy, right? And, people do this all the time. But equally well, you could delegate that to a machine. You could just, if I had a little kitchen robot, I could just tell it, breakfast is poached eggs. Don't ask me again, right? So related to this is another nice distinction. So this is following the trope of my paper, following Jacobi's dictum, always invert. So I was playing around with this and I thought this worked out rather nicely. So, how do you invert AI? Well, you can turn it into IA. And the nice thing is I wasn't the first person to think about that. So as a lead up to it, I came across this, a long time ago, I came across this quote in a book by Sherry Turkle, which is kind of nothing to do with our topic, but it's so nice I wanted to read it. So this is a grade 6 student. When you program a computer, there's a little piece of your mind, and now it's a little piece of the computer's mind. Now this is a quite different way of thinking what a computer does. So the bigger context of Sherry Turkle's quote was, rather than thinking of computers as just instruments like a bulldozer or whatever, it was more like something that helps you write poetry, right? It's writing in a language. And different people approach computers in a quite different way. She reckoned in the book I got this from, that there was some significant difference between the way women approach computers and men, right? And this was part of her elaboration of that. But I'm just using it as an introduction to this nice distinction between artificial intelligence, AI, and intelligence augmentation. And I'll give you some pointers to the history of that second phrase in a second. And there's this book by Howard Rheingold, Tools for Thought, The History and Future of Mind-Expanding Technology. So this whole book is all about, you think, okay, the human mind's wonderful, we can do certain things, but there's a lot of things that we're coming at, and we can make our thinking better if we go and build tools for that, right? Just having a shopping list would be an example. I can remember 3 or 4 random things in my head. I can't remember 20 of them. So I have a list. I've outsourced cognitive effort onto pencil and paper, right? You could do it on your phone or whatever, right? But another interesting idea here that I wanted to feed into was he makes this distinction between automating the work and not the materials. So I like this quote: if you like to play music, don't build a player piano, instead program yourself a new kind of instrument. Now, a player piano, if you don't know what the phrase means, it's an old-fashioned invention. You had this paper roll with little dots, little holes in it, and it was like a MIDI synthesizer, right? But in analog terms. So if you had one of these in your home, you could just, my dad had one. You put the roll on and you pump these pedals and the piano plays. I mean, it's an odd thing to do, but like if you didn't have a recording technology, I guess it's better than nothing if you couldn't play the piano. The point is, now think of the way people approach AI. So there's the folks that want to make this general AI that can just do everything, right? And then there's other approaches that say go under the notion of building super tools, right? Sure, I'm building these cognitive tools, but they're still tools. I'll make the distinction between tool and machine shortly. Anyway, the augmentation is all about not replacing the human, but augmenting them. That distinction, I think, matters in terms of how you think about the ethical consequences of these machines, right? You know, if you say, if I've gone and built a machine and now I walk away from it and say, oh no, the machine's doing this and the machine is responsible, we have to think about that machine in quite a different way to, I have undiluted responsibility, I've delegated some of this to the machine, but I'm still accountable for it. You know, it's like I'm driving my car on the road, I had the cruise control on because I was lazy and I was going too fast and I ran someone over. Can I blame the car? No. Right? No jurisdiction. I know that defense stand at all. I'm responsible. I chose to turn that on. I should have turned it off. So one aspect of the anxiety of the ethics of AI comes from this idea that machines think, right? And many folks are uneasy about that, right? You look at the, slightly hysterical literature about general AI and these machines that are going to go and take over. They worry that because these machines are thinking and computers can think about some things much better than we can, like they can multiply numbers better than we can, that's the thing to worry about. I found this paper by this lady. She's a literary scholar. I think she was trained as a chemist originally. She wrote this thing, Thinking with Algorithms, Cognition and Computation. Oh no, she didn't write that. That was someone else's summary. But she reminded me of something that many folks have noticed a long time ago. When the first steam engines were built, they ran at, they're a complicated machine, and depending on how hot the fire is, the steam pressure varies, the machine starts to run faster. If you want to wire one of these things up, connect one of these things up to do some useful work, you might want it to run at a constant speed, right? So the way this used to be done was you would employ a small boy, literally, like you'd get yourself some poor 7-year-old who's already out to work, and he would watch how fast the machine's going, and if it's going too fast, he'd turn the steam pressure down. If it's going too slow, he'd turn it up again. That was his job, right? James Watt invented this thing called the governor. It's just a purely mechanical device. I mean, all of you guys could easily design one of these things. The faster this thing spins, a valve closes. If it spins too slow, the valve opens up. It was one of the first feedback machines, right? For us, it's like, feedback control, we understand this. When it was introduced, people would write hysterically about it like they write about ChatGPT, right? Oh my God, we'll be redundant soon, right? Is there nothing that machines can't do, right? It was like 200 years ago. The same argument can be made about a thermostat, right? This room's kept at a cozy 17 degrees or whatever it is because, there's thermostats there, right? When it's colder outside, the heating works harder. We don't think of that as thinking. When it was first introduced, it was, right? But the point is, we're totally comfortable with it and we've just delegated it. Anyway, so reflecting on these old examples, right? I mean, I think one of the interesting distinctions to make for our purposes is this distinction between tool and machine that I alluded to earlier. So, so the thing on the left is like one of the earliest known examples of a tool. It's like 30,000 years old or something or other. It's a stone axe, people have found. And then this thing here, this is a cordless electric drill. Now, you know, many people have one of these. I guess not many people have this anymore, right? You have one of these, and where do you keep it? You keep it in your tool shed or your toolbox, right? If you want to go to the store and buy one, it's in the tools section, right? I mean, most people would say, yeah, this is a tool. Now, imagine yourself just 100 years ago, right? You walk into a room 100 years ago, holding one of these and showing what it could do. Oh my goodness, what kind of infernal machine is that, right? It would be incomprehensible. How on earth does it work by its own volition, right? People would be running terrified. The preachers would come, they'd excommunicate you, right? It would not end well, right? So, I don't know. I think that's a reasonable argument, and I think what this seems to suggest is that there's this gradation that occurs that when we are familiar enough with a machine, we think of it as a tool. Personal computers, when they first came out, right? They were infernal machines and many people were terrified of them. Some people still are. My grandfather certainly is, right? My father-in-law. Whereas you folks, computer scientists, presumably think of it as part of you, right? It's a tool. You'll be lost without it. I know I would, right? Can you think of a day when you didn't use a computer? I have to go a long way back in time, right? It's just part of you now. So familiarity is an interesting, I think an important aspect. Now, one of the most interesting kind of analyses of this idea of thinking with machines was done by this fellow, Peter Skakstad. And he uses an example from C.S. Peirce, who's an American philosopher. It's called Peirce's Inkstand. And Peirce said, you know, okay, I might be a reasonably smart fellow, but I'm way smarter when I have my inkstand. An inkstand is just this, it's just a funny name for the thing that you keep your ink bottle on, right? The point is, you know, you can think about things reasonably well. If I give you a pencil and paper, or a pen and paper, you can think about them a lot better. And I encourage you to look at this paper. It's like from 20 or 30 years ago, but I found it one of the most interesting takes on how we should conceive of the notion of a tool to help us think better, right? So there's 3 papers there, but I picked the one at the top in pink. I think if you only wanted to look at one of them, is the best bet. So this idea, so I followed this thread. I started to think, well, okay, this notion of having a machine that helps us think, okay, like a spreadsheet, sure, a calculator, sure. It goes back further. And this fellow, Eric Havelock, he was a classics scholar, and he wrote in the 1950s and 60s. And so he wrote this sentence, which leapt out at me because of the flamboyant language that he used, right? This is not what you expect someone who studies Greek and Latin to go and write. The Greek alphabet is a piece of explosive technology, right? It's a technological revolution. It's revolutionary in its effects on human culture in a way not precisely shared by any other invention. And the funny thing is that at the time when it was developed, people had the same anxieties. You can find in Plato's Phaedrus, this was written like 500 BC or something or other, he has the character Socrates ranting on about how bad the invention of written language was. It's going to corrupt our youth and people are going to become dunderheads because they won't be able to remember anything, right? It's pretty funny, right? So, you know, and you see that throughout history. When I was a kid, pocket calculators were a new thing. Everyone was anxious that, oh, well, no one's going to be able to do maths anymore, right? Well, no, we can. It's just that we don't spend so much of our life doing long division, right? So anyway, so I think this is interesting, and I think it's helpful for us to keep in mind when we try and understand, you know, our latest technologies, complicated machine learning algorithms to help us go and make decisions. Is it fundamentally any different? I would argue that, you know, even if the impacts of machine learning are as big as the most enthusiastic promoters say they will be, it's still going to fall far short of the invention of alphabetic writing. So there's different phrases people use, and I've given you some more pointers to this. Instead of cognitive technologies, you talk about the technology, the intellect. There's an interesting paper I came across arguing that, in fact, the development of language, human language, normally people think that language is a communication tool, right? I'm using language to communicate with you at the moment. This paper I point to, why language really is not a communication system, a cognitive view of language evolution. They argued that language first evolved as a way of thinking. It helped people think better. And then it was exacted for communication. Now, I suspect it's a slightly fringe view, but I thought this was interesting. That might be interesting for you to look at. Regardless of how it evolved, it certainly helps us think better. Anyway, I think I made my point. And how does it do that? Right? It does it in a variety of ways. As I've already alluded, it outsources memory. Right? So I gave you the example of the shopping list. Right? My computer has got all the papers that I've read in the past 15 years on them, right? Papers and books, 14,000 of them. Could I remember all of that stuff? No. Could I ever find one if they're on my shelves? It'd take forever. But I can use a computer to find things very quickly, right? I've got a superpower because I've got this tool. Anyway, I think I made my point. One more specific point that I wanted to make, though, was that rather than just making your thinking more powerful, it allows you to do something in thinking that you couldn't have done before. And this point was made specifically by Eric Havelock and also this guy Merlin Donald. So Havelock credits Plato with the invention of abstraction. So I thought this was funny. Like, I mean, you can find popular books, you know, list of the 100 greatest inventions ever made. You know, there'll be the wheel, there'll be fire, right? I don't know, all sorts of other things. Maybe the pocket calculator ends up there somehow. I've not seen anyone else say the number one invention was the notion of abstraction. And why is this important, right? Because without abstraction, there's no conceptual thinking. You only have image-based thinking. I elaborate this on the paper. And crucially for our purposes, there's no concept of justice. The very idea of justness, or the notion of fairness that we talked about, that's a very abstract notion. You think about the things that we talked about in the first couple of lectures, right? I mean, I can't look at a class and say, oh, it's somehow fair. I can't feel fairness, right? I have to think about it in this very removed, abstracted way. I turn things into numbers. I look at ratios, right? It's not palpable. It is an abstraction. Anyway, my point is that it's not manifest. It's all in our heads, and it's a cognitive tool that's made us be able to figure this out. Anyway, I've said that. Anyway, so to end this particular part of the lecture, I want to come back to something that I've hinted at, I think, in the previous lecture, and that is this claim here, that human ethical decision-making has always relied upon technology. So we're thinking about this new technology, machine learning. We're thinking about certain ethical dimensions to it. Fairness is one of them. There are other ones. And we get anxious about how that works. But I think if you go and look at things, I don't know, in this slightly different way, this is Daniel Dennett had this nice quote here, just as you cannot do very much carpentry with your bare hands, there's not much thinking you can do with your bare brain. I've already given you the example from Bruno Latour about speed bumps, right? And I wanted to remind you of this. This is a way, whether it's called thinking, or I don't know whether you should call this thinking better, but you're building an overall system, right? So let me try and start that again. We might all collectively agree that driving your car too fast is ethically bad. And we can go and discuss that, we can talk about it, we can agree. We can sign bits of paper promising that we won't go and do it, right? But as a practical matter, you'll be able to slow people down in their car much better if you lay the right kind of piece of concrete. So that's a technological intervention that we've delegated to. We've delegated our ethical thinking and our ethical control to the speed bump. That's the point I'm making. Anyway, so what? My argument is that rather than being a perversion to use the technology to solve ethical problems, I think it's the only way we've ever done so, right? We can't solve ethical problems without the tools of language written and spoken. When we do our thinking, certainly nowadays, our thinking is not just done inside our heads, right? We're forever using things outside of ourselves. You've got those screens in front of you. It's, you're using it to take notes. It's helping you to think. All right, we have
such a lot of looking to do. Don't know the colors of earth, don't know the curve of hill, don't know where the water flows. Such a lot of looking to do. Such a lot of looking to do. When you hear, got a lot of listening to do. You hear, such a lot of listening to do. Don't catch the message on the wind, don't feel the rhythm of the storm, don't know where the song lines go. Such a lot of listening to do. Such a lot of listening to do. If we walk it and we talk it, if we hear the music, if we walk it and we talk it, might be we'll learn to sing this country. Could be we'll sing this country. When you hear, got a lot of living to do. You hear, such a lot of living to do. Don't take what we can't give back, don't break what never mends. Wait till the heart knows all the loving living to do. All the loving living to do. If we walk it and we talk it, if we hear the music, if we walk it and we talk it, might be we'll learn to sing this country. Could be we'll sing this country. When you hear, when you
That was Coco's Lunch. I went to school with one of the singers. That's the only connection, right? Some 40 years ago. She became a musician, I didn't. So we're going to now talk about naturalizing ethics, only very briefly. Again, I'm giving you just some pointers to look at this. I figured today is much more of a smorgasbord than a really tight, coherent connection of topics. So naturalizing ethics, here's a good motivation for it by two people that have argued for it. So they say ethics is an illusion put in place by natural selection to make us good cooperators. Now, I don't know whether I would completely subscribe to that. Many people find a statement like that vehemently objectionable, but when you go and look at, the evidence that these folks cook up. So E.O. Wilson was a very famous biologist, right? Founding father of sociobiology, where a lot of this came from. So that was the attempt to understand social environments and social systems in terms of biology. I think there's certainly something to this, but of course it's not the complete story. But I think it is worthwhile being aware of it, right? So just the very idea that you can study ethical problems as an empirical natural science rather than something of moral philosophy, that's already an important insight, right? And we'll meet a few specific things later in this lecture, and I think the next one. I've given you a big stack of things here to look at. Some of them have got pretty interesting titles. I hope they pique your fancy. Monkeys reject unequal pay. So there was experiments done with a bunch of monkeys in a zoo. They divided them randomly into two groups. They they trained the monkeys to do certain tasks. One group of monkeys got, a bunch of grapes, which they really like. Another one got some, cucumbers, which they don't. And each group of monkeys could see the others, and the monkeys that were given the yucky food refused to take it. Right? So rather than just say, oh yeah, okay, fine, at least we've got the cucumbers, they'd say, what? These other guys get grapes and we don't, we're not even going to participate. So it's pretty interesting. That was written by Frans de Waal, who's written a whole book on this, Primates and Philosophers, How Morality Evolved. So that's the thing. It's not like saying, oh, all of our principled reasoning that we go and think about, like John Rawls saying we should pay attention to the worst off. These folks, they're not saying you should discard that. What they're saying is that maybe we can understand ourselves better if we can figure out how such thinking evolved, right? As a part of it. What else? Yeah, but the biological sciences can act as a ground for ethics. But anyway, the one that I singled out that I thought you might find interesting is moral heuristics, which it's a very empirical psychology paper where they go and, put people in situations where they have to make some kind of moral decision, and then they go and figure out the heuristics that the folks are using, right? So in practice, when you're asked to make a moral decision, you don't sit down and do utilitarian calculations, right? In lots of other things, you use heuristics. So they're looking at what those heuristics are and where they might have come from in an evolutionary kind of sense. One specific example I wanted to look at slightly more closely is this fellow, Jonathan Haidt, is a psychologist who's looked at moral psychology in this fashion. And I think this is very interesting. All right, so another paper I've recommended you to read, The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail, A Social Intuitionist Approach to Moral Judgment. So in there, I'm not going to give you the whole story here, but I hope I give you enough to make you want to go and read it. So he has this example. Julie and Mark are brother and sister. They are traveling together in France on summer vacation from college. One night, ... I'm not going to read out what happens. He spells out a scenario. Something happens, right? And when people read the scenario, they have this strong moral response to it. And the point that Haidt makes is that the scenario that's painted on rational grounds, it all looks perfectly fine. All of people's rational objections are completely dealt with, but people still say, no, it's still not right. So that's what he says here. Eventually, many people say something like, I don't know, I can't explain it, I just know it's wrong, right? Now, I think this is, I don't know, there's like a universal basis for human ethics. People just know, right? They have this innate sense that they know what's right, and they know what's wrong, and you're not going to persuade them otherwise, right? Yep.
Does this run a bit contrary to the idea that we need abstraction for fairness?
Yes, it does, and so that's I'm deliberately contrasting that. This is precisely my point, right? So this fellow's looking at the way people do things empirically. Mm-hmm. I put you in a situation, the clock is running, and you have to go and make this choice. Mm-hmm. And most people will do a not unreasonable thing, right? You know, most people are not monsters. They will, you know, try and do something that in the cool light of day, you'll think, yeah, actually this was a sensible thing to do. But the point is, they didn't work it out by doing calculations, right? And it may well be that what they chose to do was not the best thing that they could have done, right? So I'm contrasting, you know, what you do when you just kind of shoot from the hip, you just instinctively think this is the right thing to do, or you say, no, I've actually got some time, I'll go and do the calculation, you know. It would be like, I don't know, you're going to go and buy a car, right? You know, this one is more reliable, you can easily get it serviced, you know, it's more comfortable to drive, all of these things, all the things that you said that you wanted, right? But then you saw the old Ferrari. You think, oh, wouldn't it be cool to have a Ferrari? And you go and buy the Ferrari, and then you regret it, right? It's a big pain in the neck, right? So that kind of, you know, heuristic judgment that we make a lot of the time, that's one of my key points in the lecture. We feel we know the right thing to do. Sometimes we're actually better off calculating. So he argues very compellingly that practical morality is not based on explicit reasons and moral principles, but is something inaccessible to our conscious deliberations. Right? This phrase here, I just know it's wrong. I can't tell you why, I just feel it. I just know it's wrong. One specific thing that he develops that I alluded to, I think, at the end of lecture 3, was he came up with a taxonomy for the basis of morality. So rather than just saying good and bad, he tries to break it down into these 5 dimensions. I don't think he claims that they're the only ones and other people have come up with different ones, but here we've got 5. They're all quite distinct, right? We've actually got fairness and reciprocity. You've got in-group loyalty, like look, you know, you're a member of a tribe, you look out for your tribe. Do you respect authority or not? You know, do you want the temple to be defiled or keep it pure? So they're quite different sorts of things. And he can then study this empirically. So he devised a bunch of psychological tests to essentially build a moral profile of people. So this is not a profile of whether you're a good person and you're a bad person. It's a profile of how you think about moral questions. So for you, it might be far more important that things are fair. For you, it might be far more important that authority is respected, right? So, and he maps that out, right, in, you know, quite quantitative empirical detail. And it ends up being really quite instructive, right? So he goes and looks at, so he does all of this work and then he goes and says, well, here's an interesting categorization that seems pretty relevant to our societies, is the political one. So just this very simple-minded one of left versus right, conservative versus liberal. So you must have all had that experience. You know, each of you can position yourself in a certain way. Universities, as a general rule, are vastly overpopulated by liberals, and there's very few conservatives, so I can already guess, right? But in the general population, the balance is more even. You see that in elections. And if you take someone from each of these two sets, right, and you face them with some particular conundrum, they'll have completely different ways of looking at the question, right? And they won't be able to persuade each other to change their mind. His logic is that it's not so much it's some separate political belief that they've come to through a process of intellectual reasoning. Rather, it just reflects their moral profile. And he goes and draws nice correlations between them. He says, people on the political right, I can't remember which way it goes, they pay a lot of attention to authority and loyalty and purity, and people on the left, the liberals, pay far more attention to harm care and fairness and reciprocity. It's a psychological thing that ends up being manifest. So that's a concrete example of what you can get when you study these ethical problems as a natural phenomenon. Yeah, so it was in lecture 3 that I talked about this with the knobs. So there's 2 papers by him that I've pointed to. The New Synthesis in Moral Psychology describes this taxonomy. This one is about really just developing this notion that people feel they know what's right, but they can't articulate why. All right, so machine learning systems are of interest to us because we build these systems and they end up making decisions, right? So one of the standard complaints or worries is that we don't want computers making decisions that affect people, right? That's the way of framing it. It's not everything wrong with AI, but it captures a lot of it. So what I want to do now is to work through a little bit what we mean by making decisions, right? Because it's one of these things that at first you think, yeah, I know what making a decision is, but I hope to show you that it ain't so clear. So this is Daniel Dennett again, and you can read this. He's essentially saying that when we actually look maybe through introspection about making decisions ourselves, we realize that actually it's not so clear, right? We can't really figure out why we went and made certain decisions. But I want to move on to, I want to give you an example of this to help you, to help make it concrete. So, I need to make a decision each day whether to take an umbrella, right? So I think most people would agree that's pretty clear. That's my decision to make, right? It's a binary outcome. I either take the umbrella or not. So so the first way that I can do that is each morning, right, after I've had my poached eggs, because I've already decided that one, I take account of all factors and I just think, today I'll take the umbrella, or today I won't, right? There and then, I've made the decision. That's the way I go and do it, right? So that's the baseline, right? Now, let's contrast that to a different way that I can go and make a decision. So what I'm going to do is I'll say, well, why do I need to take the umbrella in the first place, right? It's to protect me from some rain. Whether it's going to rain or not, this is a complicated thing. I can look out the window. I don't know. But of course, nowadays, what would I do? I'd look on my phone. I'd look at the weather forecast, right? And it very handily says, probability of rain today, 70%, right? And I know what that means, right? It's a calibrated probability judged according to the Brier score, right? I know exactly what that means. And I could then decide one day, I could think, you know what? I hate making these decisions in the morning. What I'm going to do is to decide once and for now, for the rest of this decade, if the Weather Bureau says 70% chance or higher, I will take my umbrella. Great. Tomorrow comes along. I look at my phone. It says 80% chance of rain, so I take the umbrella. So just with that example, on that day, when did I decide to take my umbrella? There's 2 steps, wasn't there, right? First, I decided the abstract principle. Oh, if it's above 70, then I'll take the umbrella. And then this morning, I simply executed that rule. First, I designed a function right? Yesterday I designed the function that I would use. Today I evaluated the function on today's data. In both cases, I'm responsible for what's going on here. Now, let's think about this one further step. So I've given you two scenarios. I just decide each day. I decide on a protocol that I will look at the weather forecast. Or I could say, you know what? This constant getting of my phone out, to look at the weather forecast, you don't need my big brain for that. I've got this little robot here. I'll just program it. So it looks up the forecast, and if it's above 70%, it puts the umbrella into my bag. Right. And now, someone comes along and sees that happening, and they think, what? You're letting the machine decide whether you carry your umbrella or not? Well, no, of course not. I commissioned it. Anyway, hopefully you see my point, right? So the decision of whether to take the umbrella or not, it's not taken by a single agent, and it's not taken at a single time. Yep.
So I think an important distinction to make is when you decide upon a function and then you execute it yourself, you also each day decide upon executing it or not. Like you can still say, okay, well today I don't feel like executing on the function.
Yes, you could do that, and there's lots of people who have decided to quit smoking who face that problem, right? And there's also lots of people that sign up to a thing called a Christmas saving club. So, do you know what that is? So, if you're somewhat short of money, but you want to make sure you've got enough money to buy presents for your kids, right? So you sign up for this Christmas saving fund, right? So each week you put aside $5 into this fund, right? And the thing is, when you sign up to it, you sign up to it, the XYZ bank, right? And they say, okay, here's the deal. You put this money in. It's your money, right? They're just keeping it for you. But here is the crucial thing. If you sign this piece of paper saying you're going to sign this thing up, then you're legally bound that you put whatever money you want in there, right? But they will not give that money back to you until Christmas, right? And the interesting thing is, lots of people do this kind of behavior, right? It's it's like Cortez or whoever it was burning the bridges or burning the ships, right? You deliberately take these actions to prevent yourself from overriding your other decision. Anyway, for sure, we play all of these games with each other, but yes, I take your point, right? And certainly, if I now go and delegate the decision to a machine, yes, of course, I could always turn the machine off. Yeah. Absolutely, which is something that all of the people who worry about the AI apocalypse forget. There's an off switch.
It's basically, when you're doing it yourself, you have to put in the effort to take the umbrella with you. And if you let the machine do it, then you have to put in the effort to not take the umbrella with you.
Yes. No, that's true. Yeah. That's true. And so, in normal circumstances, you can just say, look, I've dealt with that. I don't have to worry, right? But, supposing, I don't know, there's an umbrella party going on at your workplace, right? Or for some reason you really want, you can always go and override it. Yes, but a lot of these things. Anyway, my point is that what's my next slide? Yes, it's about delegation, right? And you can then go and. So I said before, in passing, I said, so if we think of what a decision is, when we go and make our machine learning system, like mathematically, we represent a decision as a function, right? It eats this data, right? It has a very complicated model which we might have trained, and then it spits out a decision. And the decision doesn't have to be binary, but the way these systems are built, that is the way we mathematize it. It's a function, right? There's a whole field called statistical decision theory. That's what they'll say. A decision is a function. And all I'm saying is that actually we can think of it as a higher order function. Right? So if you've met higher order functions, a higher order function is a function that returns a function, right? So, on the right-hand side there, I can have d of x of 0 of x1. So I decide on day X0 what my threshold is going to be, right? That's that function. And that spits out a decision rule. I decide it's going to be 70%. Boof, I've compiled a function that now, if the probability is higher than 70%, I end up taking the umbrella. And then on the next day, I evaluate the function at X1. And I can iterate this as many times as I want, right? I don't have to have just second order functions, I can have third order functions. It's a way of mathematizing this idea of delegating certain things about what things that we're going to go and take into account. Like we could have said, there's a decision of which weather service to look at, right? Which geographical region. There's lots of decisions I have to make to go and make this work. But the idea is that some of them, they're kind of harder to make. We make them once, and then we turn it into code, and then we let the machine do the work. Now, this is the kind of the converse of this, of getting the decisions always being made for you. The opposite of that is allowing yourself lots of discretion, right? So some people might not like this idea of turning their life into a computer program. They say, no, I need the freedom to act, to be myself, right? I need to be able to decide every day whether I take the umbrella or not. Sure, you could go and do that. And what have you done in that case? You have exercised discretion, right? That's a fine thing. The intriguing thing is, so this is a very famous psychologist, Elliot Jacques. Amongst other things, he invented the notion of the midlife crisis. How'd you like to be famous for that? I think that's pretty cool, right? He did other stuff, but he invented the midlife crisis. Manufacturers of sports cars salute him, right? Anyway, so he did a lot of work about how organizations work, right? And like the chain of command and how many levels of managers that you should have. He consulted for the US Army, who implemented his work. Anyway, he said this thing that really caught my eye. The core of the psychological experience of doing work is the exercise of discretion. So this person who wants to be free every day, who wants to have the maximum discretion, they are necessarily, consequently, having to make lots and lots of decisions. They're having to do more work. So that's the point. It's a trade-off, right? How much work do you want to have to do each day versus how much work you decide to do once and for all? Anyway, so my point is we can and do delegate to others, including machines, right? So I actually left out in my development of the example with the umbrella, I could have said actually, I have a butler in my house, right? And I could have delegated this whole task to him. I'd say, James, here's my protocol. If the Weather Bureau says such and such, make sure there's an umbrella in my briefcase. Now, the distinction between delegating to a person to do that and delegating to the robot, there's very, very little difference, isn't there, right? And if on that day I go to work and I get drenched with rain, right? Say the probability was 60%, right? And I don't take the umbrella and I get drenched with rain, who do I blame, right? That's the interesting thing. And I think in many of the analyses of when machine learning systems go wrong, people would blame the butler. They say, he's the guy who didn't put the umbrella in. But actually, the blame should fall upon me. I chose the decision rule, right? So this is my point. The example I gave before with driving your motor car with the cruise control, right? No, it wasn't the cruise control. It was me who decided to turn the cruise control on and then delegate speed regulation to the computer. All right, you see my point. This fellow, David Mindel, wrote this interesting book, Our Robots, Ourselves, Robotics and the Myths of Autonomy. So this word autonomy is often used. These machine learning systems, they're autonomous. They're going to make these decisions for us. We've lost control. We need oversight. We need regulation. We need explanation. We need transparency, right? All of those responses are responses to an anxiety about autonomy. And here's this very nice line in the 21st century: autonomy is human action removed in time. I decided today how I'm going to decide tomorrow, right? He says this, in a sense, is the essence of the term programming. When we program a computer, telling the computer what to do at some point in the future when the program is run. Writing a program is delegating for the computer to do what you've decided. Anyway, I guess you see your point. You see the point. Yep.
Isn't one of the points that people make about AI being dangerous that we kind of lose track of these decisions that we have taken?
For sure.
And then, so for example, with the umbrella example, if you have someone in the household, like a kid who doesn't know about this idea and just he knows that the umbrella is there or isn't, and then he kind of loses the autonomy of knowing where the decision comes from and how to intervene.
No, absolutely, and I'll come back to that towards the end of the course, right? You're spot on, and it's interesting to think about, you know, as a stranger comes into the house, right, and sees this strange household, right, running like that, and they try and figure out what's going on. Now, if all you do is you just look at the final stage of the process, right, what do you see? You see my little robot sometimes putting the umbrella in and sometimes not. You think, really? And then what might you ask? You might ask, oh, I need an explanation, you know, of what? Of the entire source code for the robot or what, right? Whereas, you know, conversely, if you were told the whole chain of reasoning from the beginning, if that was laid manifest, then it becomes a lot clearer. And this, to me, this gets to a very key point about when you want, you know, what you're searching for there is some visibility, right, of what's going on. But what exactly do you want made visible? It's not the final step. It's the whole chain from the beginning. And you're darn right that in most of these systems, that's not documented, right? And I think it's not documented because people think, well, I'm just making the machine. I just have to make sure the machine meets this criteria. And all of this other stuff, that's not part of the machine per se. Yeah?
Also, isn't the problem that we actually don't have a rule that we strictly enforce, so we can't figure it out a posterior? Because, like, that's the whole point of machine learning, that we just say we just need to be very good at predicting if it would rain or not.
Indeed. So I'm building up to that. You're exactly right. So the example with the umbrella was kind of clear. Although, to be fair, when I said that there's a probability forecast generated by the Weather Bureau, that's typically done by an ensemble of machine learning models, right? Which is kind of hidden from you. But the point still remains, right? I mean, you could perfectly well instead say, you know what? Instead of using the Weather Bureau, I'm going to do my own weather analytics. Right? I get myself a barometer, an anemometer, I get these basic variables, and I just start learning, you know? I learn that when the barometer is dropping and the temperature is such and such, it's more likely that we're going to get rain, so I'll recommend that, right? But, you know, we can encode all of that just as a higher order function, right? So, you know, think of it this way, the model that I'm presuming exists that spits out whether it's a 50% or a 70% chance of rain. That too is a function, right? It eats all sorts of other stuff, right? The weather measurements in all the surrounding towns, right? The European model, like these, you know, global climate models. Goodness knows what, right? It goes and eats. But in the end, it's just yet another decision function. Yeah. All right. What was my next point? Oh yeah, so just on this issue of discretion, so that's right. So I'm leading up to another interesting comparison that I think is helpful. So the examples that I've given you, I've tried to frame some of the problems that we face with machine learning in a situation where there's no machine learning present. Here's another example. So where do we see complicated consequential decisions being made on the basis of numbers, on the basis of not being fully in touch with what's really going on, and it potentially causing harm? Bureaucracies. This is the way bureaucracies work. They have a set of rules, it's essentially an algorithm, right? Lookup table, a decision-making list, right? You feed in certain numbers, right? You know, what was your income last year? Do you have a rich uncle, right? You know, follow these rules. I'm sorry, you're not eligible for the social welfare, right? You could have programmed it by a computer. So this book, Street Level Bureaucracy, talks about the point about the phrase street level bureaucracy refers to the frontline people. So there's this huge government department, you know, there's a department secretary at the top or something or other, or the executives who never actually interface with the public. He's talking about the frontline people. You walk into the social welfare office and there's John, right? He interviews you. This book is about him. And in particular, the quotes that I've got here are all to do with the degree of discretion that person's got, right? So this point about discretion, I think is very pertinent, and I don't know the right way to work to think about it, but I do know that it's clearly it's a critical point in the psychology of decision making, per the previous slide. It's a critical point in purely human-made decision making, as in bureaucracies, and it seems to matter with machines. Other than that, I don't know what to say about it. Second order responsibility, I've already sort of talked about this in a way, like with the example of who is responsible. In fact, I did talk about this, right? If I get wet, who's to blame, right? The robot, the butler, the weather bureau, or me, right? I would say in that toy example, it's me, right? I set this up, right? I mean, me blaming someone else is not clear. The point is that once we realize that in most situations, our decisions are in fact non-atomic and they're distributed, they might be distributed across people, or they might even be distributed across time, and it's always us. The question is, you know, is it to my former self that I hold that, you know, he is responsible, or is it me today executing his rule that's responsible? I think it's a worthwhile distinction to make. So there is this paper, there's two papers by these folks that tried to grapple with this, right? Where they tried to think through this notion of to whom do you hold, who do you hold accountable when you have these, so that you see artifacts without agency. They're talking about technological artifacts that can do certain things they're commissioned on our behalf. So I think there is a way of thinking about this, but it's not I guess one of the main points I want to get across is just looking at the end point, which is often what is done, is clearly inadequate. Right? If we just look at the final step of the process, you can't regulate it, you can't justify it, you can't make things better, right? Just finessing with how the robot puts the umbrella in my bag, that's not the issue, right? The issue occurred many days ago when I chose to do this rule. I think that's all I wanted to say there. So so I said that in the face of these complicated decision-making processes, people want an explanation of what's going on, right? They demand transparency and so on. It's actually interesting to ask the question of our own decision-making. So take simple decisions that we make about our lives. To what extent would we meet the bar of transparency and explainability, right? You know, you chose to wear your orange jacket today. You know, why, right? Can you justify that? You know, can you give an explanation? Is your decision-making process transparent? You demand this of an algorithm, but we don't demand it of ourselves. I said before, you know, with the Jonathan Haidt example, with the moral dilemma of the brother and sister in France, people will have very firm views as to what is right, but will be utterly unable to explain why. Now contrast that to a deep neural network that can predict, maybe very well indeed, but you can't explain what it does, or rather you can't explain why it did that. So I think it's interesting to make these comparisons. Oftentimes people will just say, we're going to go and judge the technology in this way, and they forget about the way people do it. Here's C.S. Peirce, I alluded to before. Few things are more completely hidden from my observation than those elements of thought which the psychologist finds reason to pronounce immediate. You know, your experience of thinking, you can't tell what's behind it, why you got distracted by things and so on. So anyway, I made that point in pink. Psychologists are beginning to study human ethical reasoning. So not just decisions in general, but ethical decision making. And some of the most interesting work is done by this lady, Molly Crockett at Princeton, who's got a few papers here. So this one here, Molly Crockett, The Neuroscience of Moral Decision Making, is just an interview with her, right? So there's some papers that she's written that I've pointed you to. These ones I think are great, and they're short, they're easy to read, they're like magazine style, interviewing her about what's going on. And what she tries to do is to model, using the latest knowledge in neuroscience, how we make ethical decisions ourselves. So anyway, I point you to that. Other people say the same thing. Another example I wanted to give you that I thought might be also helpful. I said before that we can contrast these AI decisions to bureaucracies. Bureaucracies run on rules. Essentially they run on laws, right? So, if you think of all of the laws in a country, it's this gigantic set of rules that regulates people's behavior. And, one of the interesting things is, if you ever encounter the law, like, you end up working for a company and there's a lawsuit or something or other, you realize that there's ambiguities in the law, right? Even though it's extremely long-winded, it's often hard to see what the law really says. And so that's why you end up in court, right? Because if it was crystal clear, like if it was purely mathematical, you wouldn't need a court. You just evaluate it, it's done, right? I'd always thought that this is the problem of the law, and if they only mathematized it, then life would be good, right? And there's just that, the people that end up being lawyers, they're no good at maths. That's the problem, right? Now, I changed my mind on this because I realized that there are often people who craft the laws very often deliberately make them vague. It's not an accidental thing. They deliberately make them vague. And why do they make them vague? It's because the law is going to be around for a long time. You write the law now and it will apply in 20 years' time. You can't see the future. So what you need to do is you need to delegate certain aspects of the decision making to the people who are around in 20 years' time. The judges there. And so this fellow, Curtis, in this old book I came across, I found this quite insightful, right? Because, rather than thinking, here's this legal document, and oh my God, there's all sorts of ambiguity there, and so it's therefore terrible, right? I don't think of it that way anymore, right? He says words in legal documents are simply delegations to others of authority to apply them particular things or occasions. The more imprecise the words are, the greater is the delegation, simply because then they can be applied or not to more particulars. So I think this is kind of interesting, right? So this we've talked about the decision making. It's not atomic in time or space. We've talked about the notion of delegation. So here's another interesting dimension to this, which is the dimension of precision, how precise your rules are. Now, how you apply this to machine learning, I don't know, right? As I've said, I'm trying to throw up more problems than give answers, but I thought this changed my mind, right? I thought about these things in a different way when I realized that, yes, actually, it's the entirely rational thing to do. If you can't foresee the far future, give some delegation to your children to go and figure this out. So I don't think I'll read that. I'll let you do it if you want. This fellow is the founding father of sociology, Max Weber. He Well, I'll just tell you one interesting thing about this. So he wrote this gigantic book about bureaucracies and how they work and sort of modern societies. And he distinguished the crucial thing about these bureaucracies is that the way they make decisions is according to calculable rules. This is the crucial phase, right? It wasn't just you ask the king to decide and he can do it because he doesn't like the look of you or because, you know, you're his brother's favorite or what have you, right? The idea was that you have to go and write the rules down first and then you go and apply the rules, right? I write down my protocol, whether I take the umbrella, and then I go and execute the rule, right? Anyway, he talked about this idea of calculable rules even before Alan Turing's famous paper that is the beginning of computer science. The crucial thing is not just a rule, it's a calculable rule, right? It's something that you can readily compute. That's precisely what he meant. So I've got a couple of examples there. And the pointers I've given you to are some interesting papers like this one is Algorithms Aren't Responsible for the Cruelties of Bureaucracy. So this is an interesting take. I think it was written by a lawyer who was specifically focused on this question. Here's bureaucracies, they work with calculable rules, they have these benefits, they have these harms. Now along come algorithms doing much the same kind of work. The way we judge bureaucracies, the way we judge algorithms, it's not the same. We should try and judge them in a similar way, right? At least to make a fair comparison. I think that's quite insightful, right? Looking for the other ways of doing things. And so you don't just get hung up on the fact that, oh, it's being done by a computer. Whether it's done by a computer on, you know, a physical computer or not doesn't matter. Like you realize the word computer 50 years ago was used to describe the people, usually women, who did the calculations. You know, if you're a rocket scientist and you needed a differential equation solved numerically, you'd have a room full of ladies who'd be, you know, calculating the numbers. The point is, it doesn't matter from the perspective of what you do with the number, how you did the calculation. So I think I'm almost done. I think this is the last thing I wanted to mention. So on that point of comparing how people make these tricky decisions versus humans, so this is Molly Crockett again. So they observed the following. They were looking at, they're motivated by how people judge machines which make decisions. And as a way to get there, they looked at how people judge other people making decisions. So I go and give a decision-making task to all of you, right? A morally charged decision-making task. And I then go and look at how I judge you. I see you making the decision and I think, yeah, he did a good job of it. I see you making the decision and I think, oh God, I wouldn't trust him, right? And in particular, they were looking at this binary comparison between the people who made these so-called deontological judgments. So, you know, there's some theory of ethics that they have in mind. It's to do with, you know, duties and virtues and values, compared with the people that did calculations, right? What the philosophers called utilitarian, right? So, you know, I ask you whether such and such is a good idea, and you say yes because it, you know, it aligns with this value. And I think, yeah, nice guy. You go and calculate it and say, well, you know, this way these many people die, this other way fewer people die, so we'll do the second. And I think, you cold-hearted bastard, right? You know, I mean, yeah, okay, maybe you made the decision, but I don't like you reducing, you know, human life to numbers. He may well have made a much better decision. The point of these folks' experiment was, empirically, other folks, when they look at you making the decision, they'll think you're a nice fellow and you're not. That's the interesting thing. And so that's what they say here. We seem to have a fundamental mistrust of individuals who make moral decisions by calculating costs and benefits like computers do. I think this is very interesting, right? The point is, computers do calculate costs and benefits. I mean, we don't know how to make them operate in any other way, right? And then we get anxious that we go and put them into these situations where the decisions have a consequence, and we try and understand how can we go and deal with that. And we think, oh, it's a problem about the computer, right? I mean, we've got to regulate this technology of AI. The AI works this way, we don't like it, we've got to go and regulate it. Their point, they say, is perhaps we will find that at the root, the problem lies not with the robots, but with our own psychology. I think this is a very insightful reframing of the question, right? It's not that the robots are somehow doing something bad, right? We're stacking the game against them because we're not comfortable in this way of making decisions. Anyway, as an empirical fact. Yep.
But why is that a problem?
I'm not saying it's a problem, right? I'm saying that I think it gives insight into how we might think about building our technologies in a better way. Like if we're aware of this, like if this is a universal human trait, right? It's worthwhile being aware of that, and so we don't beat ourselves up about it. We say, yeah, look, we know you don't like it when people go and do calculations on ethical grounds. We understand that, right? This is one reason why people don't like bureaucracies. The bureaucracy does that calculation, right?
But couldn't we just program a computer in a way that it calculates how much a decision aligns with our moral values?
I don't know, right? I mean,
in theory,
yeah,
sort of problem. If it's possible, we don't know, but
I don't know. Yeah. So the point is that this other broad approach to moral philosophy that's not utilitarian, it's intrinsically not mathematical, right? So you're going to have to somehow mathematize it. And I suspect that many people would say that once you've mathematized it, you've just gone down that utilitarian route again, right? So the point is, you've almost made it impossible, right? Computers can't do anything that you can't specify mathematically, fundamentally, right? And if you say that anyone making a decision about an ethical thing in a mathematical way is bad, well, it's over for the computer, isn't it? Right? So I'm not giving you a solution to it. I'm just trying to diagnose, as they say, the root of the problem. Those questions at the back.
Isn't it like, kind of like, for me, this mistrust, I get it, and I also understand it, and I also share the opinion that probably a lot of people think like that, but isn't that like neglecting the fact that personal decisions are a lot less consistent than if we would have decisions made by some rule? Because for me, that would give me some peace of mind if I knew that decisions are reliably consistent.
Right. I don't know. That's a good question, and I can't recall whether they looked into that. Right. It's an interesting thing. Like if you could.
I don't come from the point that computers are consistent, but I mean we know that humans are not.
Yeah. No, I understand. So you could imagine a refined experiment, right? So they've basically done a comparison between its value-based or its calculation.
Yeah.
If you turn that into a 2x2 design, where on this other axis you've also got reliability of the decision, right? I can then quantify it. I can say, what's the price you're willing to pay? Okay, fine. You prefer it being values-based. I'll wear a 5% diminution in performance as long as it's value-based, right? And then the quant will come along and say, okay, fine. So let me just get this right. So that's another 100 people dead per year, and then you're happy, right? It'd be an interesting conversation.
Would that be like something we'll discuss in the essay? Or I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, trying to look, just formulating that question, I think would be interesting, right? I mean, and you see the reason I'm drawing this to your attention, right? What I like about this is that it's a slightly surprising conclusion, right? They're saying, yeah, okay, people are all anxious about this, and here we are, we're looking at all of the computers, and we're thinking, oh, the computer is the problem. And they're observing, no, actually it's all in here. Well, not all in here, but there's something going on in here that's affecting the very way that you're asking the question. And if you deny that, you've stacked the game. Yeah. Do you have a question?
No, it's
Yeah.
the same.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was basically thinking that let's say we can model a human brain, like physically we have all the models, all the scientific models to describe it. Then human decisions, either they're value-based or calculation-based, still come down to the calculation.
Yep.
So I guess it's like a feint, or it's like a fake argument that it's not a calculation.
Maybe, but I would hazard a guess that the folks that would be uncomfortable with people making decisions in a mathematical way would be equally uncomfortable with the premise that I can model the human brain in that fashion.
I see.
So, I mean, and in a way, whether they're right or not is irrelevant, right? I think as an empirical fact, there are always going to be plenty of people that will simply deny that your brain works this way. There's plenty of people that deny that humans evolved from other animals, right? I mean, that ain't going to go away. And as technologists, you've got to recognize that, well, those people are going to be around. So what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
Also, we just don't know if our brain works that way, and if we even make deterministic decisions.
No, indeed, and that's why Molly Crockett's stuff is interesting, right? She's scratching the surface of it, right? And what she can say, it's still very limited, but it's more than nothing, right? So she, they can put people into situations and see, oh well, in these situations, folks make moral decisions more like this than that, right? But it's still very primitive. But I would claim that notwithstanding the limited knowledge that we've got, it's surely better to pursue that, to the best of our ability, rather than just say, oh, well, somehow humans make decisions and we're not even going to worry about that. Yep. All right. So we're done. So what do we see today? Anna Verbitsky's point that fairness is not a universal. We talked briefly about principles versus concrete action, moral status of technical artifacts, tools for thought. A big focus was on this notion of decisions, that they're complex and they're not atomic, neither temporally or spatially, and that we can reason about that, maybe not entirely solve it, by thinking harder about the notion of delegation, who's responsible for what, where and when. Our own thinking doesn't meet the bar of transparent and explainable, because we can't even explain the way we make decisions. And as an interesting comparator, bureaucracies help us separate out the what gets done from the shiny silicon machines that actually do it.
For you, my sweet babe, I wish fish in the seas, birds in the trees, and all the wild wonders, tigers in jungles, all the wild wonders. For you, my sweet babe. For you, my sweet babe, I wish carpets of wildflowers, beetles and butterflies, and all the wild wonders, bright birds of paradise, all the wild wonders. For you, my sweet babe. For this wish to come true, we have so much work to do. All the wild